So for those of you who have followed us for a while, you know we cover Conservative Home. You know why we cover it. We cover it because it is very much uh, well, an outreach almost to the non-parliamentary Conservative Party, and there are some interesting comical articles that it puts out from time to time. But those of you will know that we always like to follow one individual in particular because he tends to write most of the stuff that we end up responding to because I feel as if it needs really does need to be responded to. But it does make, I think, a very interesting point here. As I've said before, the Will Atkinson seems to be going through somewhat of a Brexit midlife crisis. And he knows there are problems with Brexit, but he doesn't want to talk about them because that would admit that, well, there are problems with Brexit. But he's also good friends with Jacob Rees-Mogg because he does the Mogg cast with Jacob Rees-Mogg. So he's very much indoctrinated into the whole Mogmentum. Yes, that is still shockingly, even though you hear very little about it, it is still somewhat of a thing. So he is going through all this at the moment with, he wants to, I think, really talk about the Brexit problems, but he doesn't want to actually admit that it was Brexit itself that has caused these problems. So today we have an interesting article where he says, look, we've got to have be honest about our economy. And I've said this before. If you want to have an open and honest conversation about the UK economy, you have got to be honest about the impact that Brexit has had on the economy, or else you can't really talk about it. And this is what he has put forward today in his article, where he says that both Remainers and Leavers want to be honest about Brexit and at least admit that Brussels really wasn't important as they claimed to be. But of course, he's going to make some very interesting admissions for a Brexiteer, and then he's going to go and delve into the whole Brexiteer nonsense we've heard before. But it's well worth going over because this is some interesting admission states, because I think this goes to show you really, whereas we are seeing more and more polls every single time that the British public is now openly polling, yes, Brexit was a bad idea. They are well over 60% at this point, that you are now having Brexiteers ask themselves a very serious question. And I always thought we'd get here sooner or later. When do Brexiteers start to turn? At what point do we get a Brexiteer? And I'm serious about this. What point do we get a hardcore Brexiteer come out and actually say, well, you know what? We did all this Brexit, but what was it for? What was the point of it? We were better off back in the EU. Brexit has been more than a failure. And I know people say, oh, but Nigel Farage has said that Brexit is a failure. But no, he still believes in the whole Brexit grand project. He just believes that people aren't doing it properly. That is the thing I think we are going to be watching for. And I wonder, when is it going to kick in? Who is going to be the first one to break Brexit ranks and come out as someone who is a Brexiteer and fully go, Brexit has not only just failed, it was a bad project to begin with, and we should have never have undertaken it. When are we going to get a convert is the real question I'm asking. And to be honest, I will say this now. We've said this in the past. I think Will Atkinson is a lot closer to potentially becoming a convert from the Brexit cause than even he himself might think. But we'll see what happens in the future. Who knows? Maybe it'll be someone else. Maybe it will actually be Will Atkinson. We'll see. But as always, before we go diving into Will's little Brexit midlife crisis, please do remember to hit the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there's the other ways to help support the channel, the Patreon page, the one-off donation link, buy me coffee, etc., etc. It's all down below. You know the drill by now. So, as always, let's crack on into Conservative Home. with, again, like I say, Will Atkinson's Brexit Midlife Crisis very, very much still in motion. So, this is the title of his article. Brexit and the economy. Neither Remainers nor Leavers want to be honest and admit Brussels mattered less than either claim. So, let's dive into this then, shall we? So, the UK only managed 1 month, 26 days, and 1 hour outside the European Union before the first COVID lockdown kicked in. Since then, we've enjoyed our largest slump in the output since the Great Frost of 1709 and the highest inflation of over 30 years, and an energy crisis. And assessing Brexit's economic impact thus means fishing in rather muddied waters. Um, so we always said this right from the word go. COVID was the best thing to happen, to be honest, to the Brexiteers. If COVID had not happened, you would have been able to go right from day one to really see the impact of Brexit. But because we've had so many experts, so many economists looking at the impact of Brexit, we can actually see the impact of it. Now, Brexiteers will always say, "Oh no, you don't understand. It was the lockdown. It was the damaging all the supply chains. It's the you know whatever. It's anything but Brexit." And this still, and was we'll see, still continues to be the big thing. Will Atkinson opened up with an admission that, oh, there's all these damages, so we can't, can we really not attribute it to Brexit? Is it Brexit? Is it COVID? Who knows? So, but we'll continue. So, when writing about Brexit, one must also be aware of their own prejudices. For the avoidance of any doubt, I would have voted leave in 2016. I say would have, since I was 16 at the time, in the middle of my GCSEs, and yet to start shaving. Again, just to show you how young Will Atkinson is, hence why I often call him the T-boy of conservative home. But I'm sad enough to admit I was a teenage Eurosceptic, and poor you, William. I'm sure you had many a fun time arguing with your friends around the Eurosceptic campfire. I'm sure you did. And campaigned for Brexit. He was raised on a solid diet of Nigel Ferguson. Well, that's almost child abuse. Well, have you ever talked to your parents about this serial abuse that they fed you? I became convinced then that the EU was, quote, unlearning the lessons of the Renaissance. Typical Brexiteer nonsense, probably Eurosceptic nonsense. I love this. Oh, we're unlearning the lessons of the Renaissance. What? what do you mean? The Renaissance happened decades ago, years ago. We have moved on very, very much so since the Renaissance. And stifling economic growth through bureaucratic inertia and uniformity. Again, not true at all. The EU has grown. It is a very, very strong economy. It's just that these people who are the Eurosceptics are free market fundamentalists. So as far as they are concerned, and Will is about to put forward this argument himself in a couple of moments, so we'll put a pin in this and we'll get back to it later. But they are obsessed with the idea of growth. If your economy is not, if your economic line is not going up, you are a complete failure as a business and a complete failure as an economy, and your economy should just get wiped out. They nothing else matters to these people whatsoever. And we've said it before, GDP is not the number one way you should be really assessing the health and the overall economy of countries. But as we said before, these people are free market fundamentalists. So back to it. So one opportunity for leaving was to reverse this trend towards stagnation. If anything, our stagnation has been very, very much proved, while the EU does continue on a very, very good trend. And as we've said before, GDP growth is not the only way you can measure good economic opportunity, outcomes, and the activity of an economy. But of course, as we've said, these are free market fundamentalists. They are obsessed by that line going up. So, when approaching the data, I come from the natural position of wanting to show that Brexit has injected into politics was worthwhile. Fortunately, between universities, think tanks, and spreadsheet-savvy columnists, the many metrics for our performance are available. Brexit's most obvious and immediate impact, and this is an interesting admission because he is going to make some actual true admissions as to why Brexit has had an impact on our economy. This is something that I admit he's being honest about, and he will say himself he needs to be, Eurosceptics should acknowledge this, but this 16% he's about to say a reduction in our imports and exports to the EU is a massive reduction in GDP. And you would think someone who is a free market fundamentalist would be concerned by that dramatic loss in GDP that loss of trade represents. So he continues by saying this is a reality that any Eurosceptic must acknowledge. Erecting trade barriers with our nearest and biggest partner was always going to be problematic, even if the trade-off was new opportunities elsewhere. And here's the thing. You say, oh yes, the trade-off was these new opportunities elsewhere. Well, those have not really come to fruition. The Pacific Partnership isn't that good, and I'm surprised Will, someone who admittedly is meant to be a full-on Eurosceptic, isn't really questioning why we are suddenly having to accept rules from Pacific countries because they have lower standards than we do, so we are now having to accept their standards. I do not see Will crying about the sovereignty that we are giving up being part of the Pacific Partnership. And once again, we see another argument of the sovereignty argument was pretty much useless. But anyway, he continues. So a survey of over 500 firms by the British Chamber of Commerce found more than half of them were struggling with the new rules, paperwork, and checks faced by companies trading with the EU outside the customs union. While most nations saw international trade fall off a cliff during the pandemic, Britain's share has failed to bounce back at the same rate. Yes, because we are not part of the EU anymore. Most of our trade was done with the EU, which he's going to make the usual Brexit argument in a minute. So once again, we'll put a pin in that and come back to it. So furthermore, researchers at the London School of Economics have suggested that Brexit has contributed to the record food price inflation that we have seen in the last 2 years. And this is why I said in my last video, they are not going to bring in those new Brexit checks come in October, because that is going to contribute to this food price inflation by a ton. They are not going to risk food riots because people cannot afford food. This is something that they know and have been told about for the past 3 times they've kicked this can down the road. Inflation doesn't seem to be going away. It's going to make it much worse. But back to it. So food prices have risen by an average of 25% since between December and 2020 of March this year. They argue that without Brexit, those food prices would be 30% lower, and the rise began way before the current inflation spike. So this, once again, you may remember when 2016 happened, our economy took a lot of damage, and it continued to take a lot of damage because we were still determined to continue with Brexit. No one was really sure what would want to happen. We've seen investment and foreign investment to the UK plummet like a stone. That has not recovered. That has not come back. Well, Atkinson here really hasn't mentioned that. But this is the last time that, to be honest, Will is actually going to be really honest about Brexit. So I'm at least glad he's acknowledging some of those things. However, he's now about to once again take the turn into complete Euroscepticism. He has acknowledged that those are the problems, but he doesn't really seem to have any solutions or offer any solutions to these problems, because most of them, as we've said before, would at least be, well, we've got to do alignment deals with the EU or rejoin the single market and customs union. He does not want to admit that, because the second you admit that, well, maybe we have to do an alignment deal, then you have to ask the question, was it worth leaving the single market customs union? The answer basically becomes no. And once you're back in there, at that point, it then becomes, well, why did we even do Brexit or, leave the EU in the first place? This is the direction we are going as a country. We will be there sooner or later. So, continues. So, of course, the free market traders since Robert Peel have been dropping tariff as means of cheaper food. And of course, that has consequences on your domestic product, on your domestic producers. Robert Peel, of course, infamous himself doing that. This led to a massive hit on farmers during that time period. They had to undo all those dropping of those tariffs. It led to massive problems in the UK for quite some time because they dared to do this grand experiment, which we may remember we've talked about, of free market fundamentalism. They actually did it. They did the whole Liz Truss thing. They tried it for 6 years, realized that it was really bad and really negative, that actually no, we can't have zero tariffs, and no other country was joining in also doing 0% tariffs, so it wasn't really working. So, and as we said, the whole Austrian School of Economics, which is the fundamental building block for these free market fundamentalists, is discredited centuries ago, yet they still cling on to it. But it continues, despite Liz Truss's best efforts. Yeah, best efforts. If that was the best Liz Truss can do, heaven help us, what could what would have happened if she had seriously actually tried. Cutting and, of course, passing trade deals. Again, none of them have been good. Between the 15-year delay in our European trade deals, that's going to lead to a massive loss in UK farming. It's going to affect UK farming. It is basically a 15-year bomb that has been put under the UK farming industry. One of which we are seeing when we join the Pacific Partnership. Canada has already said it is going to possibly take us to the court or one of these secret courts, and it will sue us. And then, well, we will really see what happens there. But he continues, and of course, the mixed messages around the CPTPP or the Pacific Partnership. His mixed messages because it isn't good. There is no real good message around the Pacific Partnership. We seem much more willing to suck up to farmers than seize our opportunity to try and liberalize trade and cut prices. Yes, because your domestic manufacturing base matters. If you lose all those farmers, if you lose that, if you quote liberalize, which basically means deregulate, because again, liberalize sounds a lot more better word than saying, oh yeah, we're going to deregulate the farming sector, which would mean taking UK farmers back to awful standards, a massive increase in or downgrade in animal welfare. You would see farmers cutting corners, doing all kinds of really bad stuff to cows, which, of course, ultimately, if you remember, caused things like the BCSE crisis. And oh my, if we were to have another BCSE crisis, like the UK dairy industry and the beef industry would be completely destroyed. The only reason it managed to recover was because we were in the single market, we were in the customs union. If we were not part of the EU, who knows what would have happened to that industry? It probably would not exist, or it might be this tiny fraction of an industry that we used to have. But of course, again with free market, with free market fundamentalists, they do not seem to realize that if you do this deregulation and this cut prices, this will have a consequence. And then they don't seem to care about those consequences because those will be quite significant, as we said. He continues. Instead, he says that we have now combined an inevitable act of trade disruption without an attendant embrace of these new freedoms. These new freedoms are not what no one wanted and what no one voted for. Time and time again, a lot of people clearly said that a vote for Brexit was a vote against this globalism. And what have Brexiteers engaged in? They've engaged in globalism. People wanted to see a return of investment looking back into sort of UK manufacturing. That has not happened. But that's what Brexiteers promised. And instead, we have now seen that exact opposite happen of them re-engaging in all this globalist stuff and the Pacific Partnership, which are going to really, really affect our domestic industries and our manufacturing base, which means less jobs. How do you intend to solve that, Will? you know? Similarly, we have used at the end of freedom of movement to swap a steady flow of well-educated Eastern European tradesmen and baristas for surging numbers of students and dependents from the developing world. Many of those who voted to leave would have happily disrupted the Treasury spreadsheet for lower immigration numbers. But the government, again, I will at least say he's acknowledging the whole really the racist angle around people voting for Brexit. That's a very interesting admission there from Will. But back to it. But the government has managed to combine the record levels, partly because of the Ukrainian and Hong Kong refugees, with a stubbornly sluggish growth rate. Staff shortages have pushed up wages, but also forced some firms to reduce output and sack staff. So essentially what Will's saying there, that all that immigration that we used to have, and people like Will used to complain about, was actually a rather good thing. But he continues, it is with our anemic growth that the first cracks in the Brexit to blame narrative first appear. So between 1970 and 2008, as Simon Clarke recently highlighted, the UK grew at 3% a year, and since then, we have failed to reach even half that. I wonder why. What happened? What happened in 2008? What happened in 2008 that could cause such an end to this growth that we were experiencing? Oh, it's the financial crisis, the crisis that we still have not recovered from. Wages are still not back to their pre 2008 level. We have not recovered from it. Why? Gordon Brown did his best. And to be honest, Gordon Brown takes a lot of flack, but he really managed to take the UK through a very serious financial crash and managed to bring it out the other side. Now, unfortunately, he didn't get through to continue with the plans that he would have liked to have done, continuing on into that. That's when the coalition came in and went, right, time for austerity, everyone. Let's get to it. And that's what happened. And you've got to admit that austerity has had a large part to play. Once again, Will opens this with the whole idea of, well, we've got to be honest with ourselves and talk about what's going on in the economy. Yet here, he cannot admit that to the financial crisis that happened in 2008, and then, of course, his own party's ardent commitment to the full Tory austerity. He cannot even admit that this apparent open and frank conversation that apparently, like, Leavers and Remainers should have, he can't even admit that there are two big things right there he is missing out on. So, one notes that 2008 is a full 8 years before we voted leave. Yeah, because what happened in 2008, Will? What happened in 2008? And around, where are we? So, before we voted leave, and around 12 before we actually did so. Our lengthy predated, and of course, our lethargy predated leaving. And as Tim Codden has demonstrated, over the 7 years since the end of 2015, output in the Eurozone has only been 1% ahead of the UK's, driven largely by high growth rates in post-communist states but at least we're out performing the Germans. Once again, an obsession with growth. Growth is not how you really should be looking at how good a country is doing or the economy is doing as a whole. Not only that, we are advanced economies, and there's a lot of you know people who are looking at our economies now. They're looking at, well, have we reached a point where economies can't really grow anymore? Have we actually reached that point where our the relative growth of an economy is now going to be very relatively small? And this is why there is now this shift and this talk of, well, we've got to look at other ways of how we look at not only economic development but the economic activity within these countries. If you look at the EU since 2015 up to, like, let's say 2019, pre-COVID, the EU economy was doing very well. Yeah, it might have had this very slow growth, but overall, it was a very good economy to do business in. And these post-communist states that have again been driven up, that's because they invested in their economy. Poland is where it is because it went, we need to recover from communism and we are going to invest in our economy and build it up. That's what they have done. That is what they have continued to do. That is what all these post-communist countries have done. They've invested heavily in their economies. We have not. We've had over a decade of austerity where we have chosen not to do that. And as a lot of economists have said, that if we had taken the different decision to, instead of go for austerity, but instead to invest in our economy, things would be very, very different. Very different. Once again, you'll notice he is not talking about austerity, and he's not even really acknowledging the 2008 financial crash. Oh yeah, 2008 happened, but what happened in 2008? Nothing happened in 2008, according to Will. So, back to it. So, do remember that the Remain campaign suggested that the Treasury's worst case scenario would see GDP being 6% lower. Actually, the worst case scenario wasn't 6% lower, it was actually 8% lower. But there you go. With, of course, tax receipts taking a 36 billion blow. George Osborne threatened swing voters with a DIY recession, unemployment spiking by 500,000, and of course a punishment budget, all proved wrong, and much more consequential than any words on a side of a bus. Yeah, your side lied about the actual consequences of what you would do. You said you would invest into the NHS, and your party has not fulfilled on that. And instead, you're complaining about George Osborne saying, well, if we do vote leave, we're going to have to relook at how our budget happens and what we do, because Osborne and Cameron were very, very well aware of the hit that we were going to take. You've admitted right at the start of this, those two big numbers. You remember when I said, put a pin in it, we'll come back to it. The massive loss of trade, that is a big loss in our tax receipts. So Osborne was right that we need to look at that. We have seen unemployment. But, oh, it's okay because, George Osborne said that, but, we said that on the side of a bus, So the inconvenient truth for those Remainers still fighting the Brexit wars is that both the vote to leave and our eventual leap into doing so have changed remarkably little about the UK economy. That's absolutely false. It has changed the UK economy fundamentally. There is now an internal border between the UK and the rest, and Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is in the single market customs union and is outperforming the rest of the UK regions significantly. You have businesses that are constantly being affected, as you have even admitted to. We've had a massive loss in our trade. This has fundamentally changed the UK economy. So even you can't admit to that. That is your own inconvenient truth, Will, that you still have, again, wanting to have an honest conversation about the UK. You're openly admitting now you don't want to, because you can't talk about Brexit. You can't talk about the massive years of austerity we've had, and you haven't even bothered to mention what happened in 2008. As if just nothing happened in 2008. That was it. Nothing happened. He continues, partly, this is because we have failed to seize the opportunities available in removing the trade barriers or deregulating. Once again, these trade barriers, that is Will saying we want tariffs at zero. I really do believe that Will is a free market fundamentalist. There's lots of stuff to say in this very article that he is a free market fundamentalist. That lowering tariffs to zero would be disastrous for our economy. Because here's the thing: if we say everything coming in is now 0%, then every other country would go to the WTO and absolutely have a field day with us in those courts. It would dramatically destroy pretty much everything about our economy here, the jobs base, you name it. It would absolutely just destroy it very, very quickly. And then your whole thing with deregulating. Well, the British public has been very clear, doesn't want to deregulate. And in fact, it's worth trying to go back and find out what Leave was actually saying about deregulating. In fact, I don't think they really talked about deregulating because, of course, you may remember Daniel Hannan, the brain of Brexit, said that we weren't going to leave the single market. Only a fool would leave the single market and customs union. So, although the recent changes around gene editing provide causes for optimism. And that's it. Oh, gene editing? Whoop-de-doo. Whoop-de-doo. Yeah, the Westminster mood music is towards either scaling back deregulatory efforts or imposing more under the umbrella of animal welfare, consumer protection, or net zero. The blob is just as keen on the stagnation as Brussels. Again, Will not understanding why regulations are so important. Why we have regulations to protect consumers, to protect the animal welfare, to protect the environment. And the blob, no, that's civil service going, hey, we've got this law, we've got this. Maybe we need this new type of regulation to stop, exploitation of workers, the environment, etc., etc. Regulation is important. And yet the Conservative Party, or at least part of it, as you can see here, is obsessed with going over this deregulatory agenda. They still want to do that. But luckily, as we always said, the big split in the Conservative Party was those who were massively against deregulation, which were all pro-Brexit, and those who were all actually regulation is a good thing. Those tended to be very much on the side for remaining. Some moved over onto Brexit, but they're still for regulation. So at least that side has remained at least very prominent. Because if we do start to deregulate, well, then that affects our trade with the EU even more. Like I say, for all the talk, these free market fundamentalists talk about wanting to unleash the potential of the UK, of the economy, they don't really seem to understand how the economy would work. or the effects and the consequences their idea would have. Because to them, if they follow this route, this ideological route, everything is rosy, everything's picture, we're all going to get richer. But that's not the case. It is not the case at all. So, a pro-European integration German foundation called the Bertelsmann Stufen, I think that's how you say it. The Bergmann Stufling produced a report outlining how countries in the single market have benefited economically from it in the 2 decades since its foundation. They estimated that the average Dane has probably done best, cumulatively gaining over €10,000 per head in that time frame. The average Brit does €250 better off, a measly 10 or so a year. So once again, we will say what happened in 2008. Wages stagnated since 2008. They have not returned. In Europe, they have. So I'd be very interested in seeing what else that report had to say about that. And was it telling why Brits might be so worse off? The fact that we did have an underperforming economy. So, for context, this is about a 20th of what our average membership payments were per person. But this shouldn't be surprising. The UK's growth rate has been slower since the single market was established, and our trade with it is shrinking from about 55% of our exports in 2006 to 45% in 2015. Once again, this is very, very deceptive. This was one of the big things that the Leave campaign ran on, that, oh, look, the EU is not that important, because in reality, we only export about 45%. Yeah, goods. On goods, we do 45%. But this is also, once again, reflective on the UK economy. Manufacturing has been decreasing since that time period, since 2006 to 2015. And you'll notice that he chooses that time period, not, as he says, maybe the UK's full time in the single market, to see growth trends and to really examine what's going on in this period, what's going on in here. Because when you really look at that, what does it exclude? It excludes services. They only count goods, not services. And what are we? We are a service-based economy. 80% of our economy is based around services. That does not account, that 45% does not account for any of those. Once again, something else that is being heavily affected by our exit from the European Union. So, looking at such long-term trends is vital in assessing Brexit. So, here's the thing. Will says here, of course, that that would have continued. That would not have likely have continued. This idea that it would have been a downward trend would have not been continued. Certainly, our manufacturing base is shrinking because, well, they haven't really invested in it. And like I say, the Tories have not invested in the economy. Even now, even on their levelling up program, they didn't invest in the economy. Also, as we said, those numbers do not account for services. So, continues, not only because we've had this 45 odd years of membership to judge its merits, but because we currently have COVID, inflation, and the consequences of the Ukraine war clouding the picture. I love it. He starts off at the top of this article saying, look, yeah, we know there's all this confusion around this stuff, but there's all these experts that are digging into Brexit and have identified all the things that Brexit has done. Meanwhile, he comes back later and says that, oh, yeah, all these long-term good for assessing Brexit, but because of COVID, inflation, and the Ukraine war, it's clouding the picture. We can't really see. Meanwhile, remember, as I said, put a pin in it. Uh, he said at the start of this article, there are all these experts, all these people who have been very savvily looking at the data and the spreadsheets to identify Brexit related problems. He then went on and mentioned problems caused by Brexit. And yet he's falling back on the same thing of what we've seen all these Brexiteers. Oh, we can't really judge Brexit because of COVID inflation and consequences of the Ukraine war. Same thing we hear all the time. So back to it. So Brexit-related tariff and non-tariff barriers do play a role in inflation. But lockdowns and monetary incompetence of the Bank of England, again, he's blaming anything else, not Brexit. And of course, Putin's invasion of the Ukraine war were far more important. Core inflation remains stubborn across the continent, and comparing our overall weights to, say, that of Spain obscures how the vagaries of the energy supply affect cost. The already poor trade deficit also looks all the worse for Putin's meddling. Yeah, but you said we can tell the difference because there are people who have looked at what the exact effects are, and now you're trying to say, well, we can't get a real clear picture because of all this stuff going on. But you started at the very start of this article, Will, saying that universities, think tanks, and your fellow savvy metric data reading fellow economists could analyze and look at and see the effects of Brexit. And now you're saying you can't. Which is it? You either can see the effects of Brexit or you can't. Which is it, Will? You can't have it both ways. But he continues with, we have failed to bounce back as quickly as other countries, and this owes far more to our sluggish public sector recovery, down from 6.8% in 2019 than anything Brexit related. They must also be balanced against the boost provided by our successful vaccine programs and attempt at early unlocking, something facilitated only by a Brexiteer government. I thought, Will, this was going to be a conversation about honesty. That's not true. That is not true. It was, yes, congratulations, we had a good vaccine rollout, but this was not because we Brexited. A lot of the stuff that we were doing, when we were doing it, we were still members of the EU, meaning we still had to follow EU rules and regulation, and we still had this amazing vaccine rollout. Meanwhile, Denmark, who you say has economically done better than us, according to your German think tank that you've sourced, says they've said that they were like the second to start rolling out vaccines, and yet they had a faster rollout of the vaccine. Yeah, no. Once again, trying to link the whole vaccine to Brexit is ridiculous. It's purely ridiculous, Will. It's a stupid argument. But he continues. So, but there are also a record of 2 million out of work being long-term sick, a number that has surged since lockdown, and it comes at a time when both unemployment is low and vacancies stand at over 1 million. Taking this will mean returning the subject of welfare dependency that the Tories have long since neglected more anything than Brexit related. Well, maybe if you invested in the economy and invested in these people to help them get back into work, maybe that wouldn't be such a problem. And I take big issue that it's welfare dependency. Because if you know or have spoken to anyone who is on welfare, it's not exactly something that they want to live on. But it's all they've got. It's very much a lifeline. And it's because of your government that has made it in such a dire state. And like I say, they ain't going to touch it. So the greatest consequence of Brexit has been to force the politicians to listen to voters who were long ignored and ask broader questions about what our future economic model should look like. Well, if you want the voters to know, when you look at polls, they want to engage in more protectionism, and of course, well, as a free market fundamentalist, so I'm sure he would balk at the very idea of more protectionism for the UK economy. They want the government to invest in the economy. They want to see more investment in public services, everything that they are not listening to. you know, they're not exactly listening to you. They weren't exactly listening to voters pre-Brexit either. So there you go. Our exit has released us from the constraints, and it is now only our own fault that we have failed to use this freedom properly. Love it. This is the new this is something we should have probably done a video about, the new excuse of why Brexit has failed. You see this all the time from the Brexiteer camp of, oh, the only reason Brexit failed is we haven't taken use of these new freedoms properly. If only we're doing it properly. If only they listened to these freedoms. Meanwhile, these freedoms are just complete deregulation. We lower all our tariffs to zero, and we somehow become this Singapore on the Thames. We lower our tax rate to next to nothing, and somehow magic. But of course, it's not what people really voted for when you asked them at Brexit. It was not what they voted for. And if Leave had been honest, if they had said, this is what we actually want to do, this low market, low tax, no regulation country that we want to turn it into, would they have won the referendum on that? I don't think they would have, Will. I really don't think they would have. So, Vote Leave always argued that Brexit was only the beginning of our reforming our economy. And yet they never actually talked beyond that. They didn't tell you that that was eventually the plan because they knew that people wouldn't vote for it. So it was only the beginning, not the end. It is down to these vagaries of human personality and institutional inertia that they could not see that through. So again, you've had a massively pro Brexiteer government, and they did not take advantage of these freedoms. You even have a majority in Parliament that does support Brexit still, and yet you're not taking advantage of these freedoms because we know what the consequences would be, especially if we deregulated, what that would mean to our trade with Europe. So, and as ever, the problem Britain has are politicians willing to babble about growth, but uninterested in doing anything actually designed to deliver it. I'm glad we sort of share our share something similar there, because I would say it is politicians saying that they're going to invest in the UK, but they never do. They never actually deliver on it. At least your party certainly hasn't delivered on that, because it has been the one who has been in power over many of these problems that we have faced and only made them worse. And then I like how he finishes with this. To misquote the bard, the fault lies not in Brussels, but ourselves. And that is something I have argued, Will. That is something I have argued constantly on this channel. That is really where our problems lie. That is really where they are because of that. And we always said, and I always said in particular, that if we do this, the UK's problems were never caused by Brussels, never caused by us being in the EU. It was caused by the 2008 financial crash. It was caused by the Tories. Instead of actually investing in the UK, gutting all the social services, the social safety nets, the investment here into the economy to completely go gung ho for austerity. That's what the real problem was. And it shocks me that Will's done the exact same thing all Brexiteers do, saying, oh, we're going to have this open, honest conversation about Brexit and the economy. Yeah, he hasn't been open and honest about this conversation. I don't think at all. We really do not think anyone could say Will has actually been open and honest about the cost of Brexit, what it has done to the economy, but also, for some reason, didn't even talk about the effects of the 2008 financial crash, which I find very disingenuous. Very disingenuous there, Will. And of course, the effects of Tory austerity on the economy and on the UK. Can't have an open and honest conversation, not only just about Brexit, but if you can't admit whose fault it really has been in guiding and the ones in charge of the economy, it has been the Tories. Been your party, Will. No one else. And yet, here you have Brexit, which is your own party's child, which was DOA. Everyone was telling you, all the experts were saying, this is going to be the problem. How are you going to solve these problems? And yet, your answer was just, oh no, Brexit's going to be great. It's all going to be fine. You're even repeating this now, that same mantra that you have not escaped from since 2016. Meanwhile, us Remainers have moved on and we've said, look, now you've done Brexit, there are all these problems we were warning about. How are you going to solve them? What are you going to do? Our position is now we want to see closer, not only closer alignment with the EU, but we want back into the single market customs union and eventually to seek full EU membership again. We've evolved. Brexiteers haven't. They're still obsessed, or going to be obsessed now with the idea that Brexit just wasn't done properly. That's the new argument, that, oh, Brexit would have worked. And what was it a long time ago? I think we heard, I can't remember who initially said it. This is going to be the new thing you often hear from communists. Oh, communism would have worked if, or but, or it would have worked only if this had happened. This is now the call you're going to be hearing from these right wingers in the UK for years. Brexit would have only worked if we had done this, this, and this. If we had done this, if we had taken advantage of these opportunities, of these possibilities. That's what the new Brexiteer mantra has become. But this has been a long one today, so I do apologize. But like I said, I think it was well worth going through. But I will say this now: Will has not had and been honest in this blog, starting off with the whole thing of, well, look, we're going to have an open conversation about Brexit. We know that there's been all these problems, but look, there's all these people who have identified, no, this is specifically a Brexit problem. Here are some of the problems that they have identified. And then you have gone on to say that, oh, actually, we can't really tell because of all those problems. That is not an open and honest conversation about Brexit. You didn't even mention the 2008 financial crash and the problems that has itself created. You didn't even talk about Tory austerity and the problems that itself has also created. How can you have an open and honest conversation when you can't even talk about those things? When you can't even really talk about Brexit itself and the consequences Brexit has had on the UK? So there you go. A Brexiteer tried to be honest, but in reality, he can't, because if he does, well, then he's got to admit his entire precious project has been an absolute failure. And the only reason it's a failure, according to them, because it hasn't been done properly. So, as always, until next time, because it's been a long one, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.